It would be difficult to regard the modern Irish literary movement as an unqualified success if criticism were to judge it in strict terms of the intentions declared originally by its leaders. Social and political conditions, as ever in Ireland, have conspired during the past 2 decades to defeat the hopes that once glittered so brightly in the minds of Mr. W.B. Yeats and his old comrades in art. If the Irish theatre is not already dead, it is not because new playwrights and poets have arisen to maintain the old spirit of Synge and Lady Gregory. Their plays, with those of Patrick Colum and Yeats himself, have gradually been crowded off the stage onto our bookshelves, and there, it appears, they are likely to repose for an indefinite period. A few new poets and prosemen have cropped up since 1914, but those who are not merely aping the work of their older compatriots seem to have turned away from Ireland to follow an alien tradition. James Joyce, in whom once so many high hopes were placed, has taken his perverted and bewildering genius to thrive, or it may be to decay, in other fields than those his elders ploughed. Others, like Liam O'Flaherty, have but little direct connection with the old ideas of the movement. The best-laid schemes of the originators have gone agley. But it would be foolish and ungrateful today to recall in detail what those schemes were. In the attempt to carry them out, a body of fine literature has been created and continues to be created. Within the past few years, we have had 2 of the most powerful prose works Ireland has ever produced, both by Mr. James Stephens, who is gradually retelling, in inimitable style, the old legends of his country. None of his compatriots has created a Deirdre to compare with his. The same author has recently added another to the bright array of his little but precious books of verse. A.E. has just published a new volume of poems, the first in many years, as good, if not better, than anything he previously gave us. The youngest of the old group, Patrick Colum, in his Connecticut home, has never forsworn his very Celtic muse, and the latest of the Nobel Prize winners was W.B. Yeats, the greatest of all Irish poets who have written in English. Nevertheless, these outstanding Irish poets of today were also the outstanding Irish poets of the pre-war decade. The younger poets, like Higgins and Austin Clarke, cannot compare with Yeats, A.E. or Stephens as they were in their youth. The members of the old group are aging, and it seems that the Irish literary movement is threatened by a setting sun, not without some rare music at the close. At this stage, it may perhaps be said that these poets, for all their passionate sense of nationality, have not achieved that unity of purpose, that intensely national type of literary expression that was anticipated in the original program. It would be idle to discuss the extent to which the deliberate attempt to create a new Irish literature has been hindered by unavoidable English influences. Is it possible to write the literature of one race in the language of another? Whatever may be the answer to that difficult question, it cannot be denied that the body of Irish poetry, and it is poetry with which we are chiefly concerned here, has been informed during the past 20 years or more by a spirit in most respects alien to the contemporary English spirit. This has been due largely to the influence of W.B. Yeats, whose practice has determined more than any other factor the particular type of Irishness we have recently come to know. A.E., however, has never been primarily an Irish poet in the same way as Stephens, Yeats, and Ledwidge. His sympathies with the general aims of the other poets cannot be doubted, but poetic practice has revealed him as the subject of a mood different at nearly every essential point from theirs. Where Yeats and Stephens have seen the world in terms of Ireland, A.E. has seen Ireland in terms of the world. Always a mystic, if a pantheist can be called a mystic in this year of grace without begging the question, he has been concerned with the types of things and not with particular examples. No doubt his poetry refers to the Irish scene, but the reference is always indefinite as compared with the references of his fellow poets. The wild swans of Yeats are seen at Coole. His lake owl belongs to Innisfree. A.E. would have reduced them respectively to swans anywhere and a lake owl nowhere. In fact, he does not appeal to the human consciousness of the universal scene by means of the typical appearances of a particular local scene. An Irishman reading his poetry will easily recognize some adumbration of the Irish countryside, but one who has never been in Ireland will find little that is unfamiliar to stand between the verse and his understanding of it. Twilight, a blossom grey in shadowy valleys dwells, under the radiant dark the deep blue-tinted bells, in quietness re-image heaven within their blooms, sapphire and gold and mystery. What strange perfumes, out of what deeps arising, all the flower bells fling, unknowing the enchanted odorous song they sing. Over all his descriptions hangs something of that atmosphere that belongs notably to Shelley. In fact, no other poet who has written in English since Shelley has had so much in common with him as A.E., but the resemblance appears more in the kind of imagery and simile employed than in the philosophic nature of the poet's ideas. These are essentially Wordsworthian. Only the humble stones have kept their morning starriness of purity immutable. Being unfallen they breathe, only unfallen lie, and with my cheek pressed to their roughness, I had part regained my morning starriness, and made these songs half from the hidden world and half from this. The attitude is even better expressed in the short lyric called Dust. I heard them in their sadness say, the earth rebukes the thought of God, we are but embers wrapped in clay, a little nobler than the sod. But I have touched the lips of clay, Mother, thy rudest sod to me is thrilled with fire of hidden day, and haunted all by mystery. It did not require an Irishman to say this. A.E.'s poetry is none the worse because it springs from one of the oldest mystic, I prefer to say philosophic, if not actually scientific, realizations of a certain type of mind. Most of his lyrics are in the nature of variations on the one theme. In his imagery, he prefers a cloud to a rock, a rainbow to a rose, and even his rocks and roses are clouded over with mist and twilight. He sees everything through a veil and sees everything as a veil. All nature is symbolic, and each particular stone or blade of grass is a symbol contained in the symbol of the whole. Unlike Yeats, he does not make it into a symbol. It already exists as such. The resulting dimness that saturates his verse, and it is never the dimness of obscurity, is not to be confused with the famous Celtic twilight of Yeats and the Yeatsian imitators. It is the same quality that Matthew Arnold remarked in Shelley. Ireland has no preemptive claim upon it. The fact is that A.E., as has already been suggested, is first of all a mystic poet, and only secondarily an Irish poet. It would be almost impossible to find a poem in the earlier books of Yeats that does not appear to bear some unmistakable mark of its author's nationality. Even in his purer, later poems, there is generally some curious turn of phrase, some idiom of the Irish voice that marks it out not only as the work of the poet Yeats, but also as the work of Yeats, the Irishman. And this is in spite of the fact that he has gradually whittled away from his poetic style every element that is not the absolute essence of his own artistic individuality. A.E. is less explicit in all respects, though never more economical in artistic practice. The difference is determined, of course, by the fact that A.E. is engaged in the continual apprehension of abstract ideas, the mystic or philosophical meaning, the significance of the appearance of things, while Yeats, less concerned with transcendental perceptions, is essentially a poet of the intellectual imagination. He is not satisfied with his apprehensions. He must also comprehend. Thus, after discounting the style and the argument in both poets, it appears that Yeats makes use of the particular Irish appearances of things in order to achieve his recognitions of their universal qualities, while A.E., to put it bluntly, sees a cloud as a cloud and not as an Irish cloud. He begins by idealizing everything, but Yeats tends to idealize nothing except his personal emotions, and this habit of mind whereby A.E. sees every natural phenomenon as a symbol of one thing, God, is not the typical Irish poet's point of view. It is much more typically Wordsworthian. At times it tends very definitely to be associated with the more transcendental thought of the Orient, but, at its best, the general view is well epitomized in the lines from Tintern Abbey. A motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Thus A.E. is that rarest of modern men of letters, a poet with a definite point of view, by no means original in its philosophic character, yet startlingly original by means of the poetic ways whereby it is presented. In this sense, Yeats has no particular view to present. He is a poet governed by innumerable moods of the conscious imagination, not by any deep realization of some philosophic conception or faith. Accepting such things as a fundamental to all good poetry, his work has few of the characteristics usual among his contemporaries in England and Ireland. If he derives from anybody, it is from Blake. But the most striking aspect of his poetic growth is the Blake-like determination to free himself of all extraneous influences, and gradually, in the course of many laborious years of work in his art, he has achieved a poetic idiom, a perfect style, so remarkably individual that criticism is tempted to clap its hands and leave the flower undissected. And this exceptionally individual tone of his poetry is not that of his most familiar earlier work. 15 years ago, lazy critics were writing him down as a mystic and a symbolist, usually because of the affectations that then characterized his typical work. He might have indulged in the worst kind of obscurantism, and many would have accepted it, content not to understand its meaning because of a superficial pleasure to be taken in its ornaments and decorations. Yeats never appeared so much the master of his art as in that comparatively unknown and neglected volume, The Wild Swans at Coole. In his collected poems, it stands out in poetic quality far beyond the other peaks of his achievement. These later poems make much less difficult reading than the poems of 1889. That is to say, their meaning is much more clearly defined, less ambiguous, and dependent on semi-esoteric allusions than before. But as they are also less immediately romantic, less glamorous, and do not fall back upon the old mythology so frequently, a reader of the earlier poems often tends to overlook their greater plasticity and depth. With the toning down of the old mythological elusive appeal, much of the superficial fascination has disappeared. The essential poetry, however, has merely been driven inward. A characteristic poem from The Wild Swans at Coole is altogether purer in essence than one from The Wind Among the Reeds. Take, for instance, A Deep Sworn Vow. Others, because you did not keep that deep sworn vow, have been friends of mine. Yet always when I look death in the face, when I clamber to the heights of sleep, or when I grow excited with wine, suddenly I meet your face. The new restraint, the quietness of the verse in this and most of his later work, see particularly the title poem of the volume, cannot deceive anybody but a reader insensitive to the nuances of language and rhythm to think that the old passion of Yeats has waned. Actually, it is stronger and more vital than ever. The poetry is chastened in the extreme. Its surface scarcely ripples, but in the crystal depths we recognize the essential lineaments of the old intellectual imagination that used so often to disguise itself in the property masks of the Irish movement. Yeats himself has told in verse how and why he forswore his original ornaments and took to the naked verse of his recent work. I made my song a coat, covered with embroideries out of old mythologies, from heel to throat. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes, as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. This shedding of the coat has given the modern world of poetry its most original voice, saving perhaps Thomas Hardy. Neither Bridges nor Houseman, Yeats's greatest compeers, has forged a more powerful instrument than this that produced such a poem as The Wild Swans at Coole. The trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones, are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me, since I made my count. I saw, before I had well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. Unfortunately, there is not space available to complete the quotation. Here and generally throughout the same volume, the poet achieves the maximum quality of poetry with the minimum amount of apparent effort. The tone of the verse is almost conversational, and yet that almost contains the whole difference between the quality of casual conversation and the quality of great poetry. The obtrusive symbolism has disappeared with the strained allusions and the artificial mists of the Celtic twilight. Nothing extraneous remains. It may be well to take the simplest instance of all, the poem To a Squirrel at Kyle na Gno. Come play with me. Why should you run through the shaking tree as though I'd a gun to strike you dead, when all I would do is to scratch your head and let you go? There is more cunning here in the contrivance of verse than in any 10 of his earlier poems added together. Throughout all this later work, the poet's meaning and rhythm never falter. His language is diamond-like, cut from the solid rock without a flaw, and the impulse of the poem shows no less spontaneous and beautiful than that of his most popular poem, the anthologist's favourite, with its wonderful vowel play, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. It is not in that, however, that we must look for the essential W.B. Yeats, but in the altogether rarer poetry of the later books. It would be a mistake to disparage such excellent early work for the mere purpose of attracting attention to what has followed. Such is far from the present writer's intention. But it is the inevitable temporary fate of every poet who has achieved a certain degree of popularity to secure it by means of a single poem or a single book in such a way that his subsequent work is neglected or insufficiently appreciated. In previous essays in the English Journal, I have tried to indicate how this same thing has happened to some English contemporaries of W.B. Yeats. In his instance, there is even less justification, for he is among the 2 or 3 poets who stand ahead and apart from all who are writing today. The poetic genius of James Stephens has won recognition slowly, but it was never better founded than during the past 2 years in America. His wonderful aptitude for prose romance tends to distract attention from his no less important poetic gifts. Nobody has ever written simpler poetry. His work may be said scarcely to deal with ideas at all. A bird's song, the cry of a snared rabbit, and the vital, overwhelming desire to release it. The crooked windings of a goat path on the side of a hill. These and such as these are his themes. He seeks only to convey the feeling of an experience, never to describe it in any realistic sense. And, rarest of attributes among the serious poets of today, he has a certain tint of humour that comes to glitter on the edges of his happier moods, with such a brightness as belongs only to poetry. It is often faintly ironical, not unlike the humour in Deirdre and The Crock of Gold. This has given us the unique poetry of Peter Ogg Goes Courting and The Merry Policeman, to say nothing of such a remarkable poem as The Soothirer. But the best of James Stephens is to be found in those intense and passionate poems of the sympathy which relate his work so closely with that of the English poet Ralph Hodgson. Such things as The Snare. I heard a sudden cry of pain. There is a rabbit in a snare. Now I hear the cry again, but I cannot tell from where. But I cannot tell from where he is calling out for aid, crying on the frightened air, making everything afraid. Making everything afraid, wrinkling up his little face, as he cries again for aid, and I cannot find the place. And I cannot find the place where his paw is in the snare. Little one, oh little one, I am searching everywhere. The same keen intensity characterizes his gayer moods. He will take a mere phrase and turn it inside out and round about in unfailing poetry. In terms of reason and argument, he seems to be saying scarcely anything at all, but in between the lines he can convey the meaning of his mood, the sense of an experience, no less clearly than Alexander Pope could make the epigrammatic statement gleam through his rigid couplet. I heard a bird at dawn singing sweetly on a tree, that the dew was on the lawn and the wind was on the lea, but I didn't listen to him, for he didn't sing to me. In a further 2 stanzas that do little more than vary the order of these phrases, he makes his own song vie with that of the bird. The matter is slight enough. Not so the mood. Stephens has definite limitations, but they are the limitations of a fairy. He is an elf among the modern poets, and no line that he has written could discredit the art of Shakespeare himself.